All right. So, Daniel Shapiro, he is a graduate of the University of Chicago Law School, a lifelong Chicagoan. He has practiced trial law nationally for many years. He enjoys spending his time reading and hanging out with his grown children. The Thin Ledge is his debut book, and he is currently at work on a second book, a novel about an aging lawyer, late career ambition, and ethnicity in a changing woke world. That sounds interesting. And welcome. Dan, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks very much, Lindsay. I appreciate it. So I'd like to be really informal about this. It's not a huge group of people. And so, to the extent that people have questions, my presentation is not going to be long, but if anybody wants to interrupt, feel free and we can just have a conversation. That might be interesting to some of the people on the phone or on the Zoom. First, I want to acknowledge what Angioma Alliance has done. I was looking at the website, which I haven't done in a long time, and what this organization has sort of turned into in the last 20 years is remarkable. If you look at the Scientific Advisory Board, putting aside the board itself, but the Scientific Advisory Board is a pretty stunning collection of neurosurgeons and neurologists and PhDs, and it's really a remarkable group. So congratulations to you on being able to do that. So I was asked to speak for a few minutes, and then, as Lindsay was saying, and then move into a Q&A. And it seemed to me that there are some things that have come up sort of consistently as I've started promoting the book and talking to people and in interviews. And I haven't done dozens of them so far, but I've done enough to sort of recognize the points of interest, I think, or some of the points of interest. And I'll try to touch on those in these introductory remarks. They sort of fall into two categories, I am finding. One is process, which is how did I come to write this and over what period of time and sort of what was the mechanic for doing that. And then the other is the story. And the story is, I'm going to be abbreviated about the story primarily because a fair number of people who are on this Zoom know the story. And so I don't want to bore them to tears. And then there are other people who don't, or at least I don't know them. And so I'll give sort of an overview, and maybe we can cover more detail in the Q&A if people are not satisfied with that level of detail. So the process is pretty straightforward. I've really always written, although almost all of my writing has been as a lawyer for the last 40 years. But I started out, before I was actively discouraged from being a journalist, I started out wanting to be a journalist, actually a photojournalist, and I was told that was a big non-starter if I wanted to make a living. Whether that's true or not, I listened. And so I wound up going to law school, and it all turned out just fine. But this is the first book that I've written, the first sort of serious effort to write something other than what I have needed to write for clients and in my practice. I would say about half of the book, maybe a little less than half, was written in real time, more or less. I was writing as I was experiencing some of these events. I don't think, some people have referred to it as journaling. I don't really think of it that way. I was writing differently than that. It wasn't really to capture exactly the experiences. It was more to sort of record the things that I was finding challenging and that I thought would be challenging over a long period of time and I was going to have to deal with. So I was writing that as I moved along. And then once I decided to turn it into a book, I wrote the other half of what is in the book now, or maybe more than half. It was more sitting down and actually getting more serious about telling the story in a coherent way and developing some of the thoughts that were not much more than jotting down ideas in real time. And so over a period of, I don't know, I would say about 10 years, I was working on this one way or another before I was done with it and ready to publish it. One of the questions I get asked fairly often is whether this process was therapeutic in some way. I don't really think it was, to tell you the truth. I think it is just something that I wanted to do. I think it has some value to me, and so maybe there's some therapeutic value there. It has value to me in that I think that as I was having the experiences that I was having, I was looking at what was publicly available, either on the internet or in books or in chat rooms about this kind of experience. And I thought that that was really thinly developed. There just wasn't much help to find from people who had had the experiences that I was having, which I was surprised by. And there were a few books that sort of got close. Joan Didion wrote a book that was really good, as is everything that she writes. And it was about the death of her husband and how she, ultimately the death of her daughter too, which coincidentally was sort of in the same time period. And so she captured some of this, but not quite. I thought it wasn't really quite the same experience. A lot of what I tried to capture, which was most difficult about this, has to do with obligations and morality and value systems and how you account for yourself in difficult circumstances. What happens when you find yourself being pressed up against the limits of what your value system knows how to cope with, and what right and wrong means to you, and what do you do when the answers just aren't very clear, and how do you navigate that? There wasn't, I really did not find much in terms of what was in the public domain, what was available to look at. And so I found that writing this would be getting back to the idea, was this therapeutic? Maybe in the sense that I feel like I've made some contribution to fill in a gap, or at least augment what was already out there that other people have found I didn't particularly. But I think addressing those questions, I find that as heroic as the medical profession is, and the caring, the helping professions are, they're not great at dealing with, and it's, I guess it's just not their job. They're not trained for it. They're not great at dealing with those questions. If you're trying to figure out what to do with your life in the context of a relationship where somebody else is failing and changing in a dramatic way, so that the deal that you made in the instance of a marriage, but a marriage is only one iteration of this. It can happen lots of different ways. If you find yourself looking for guidance, I didn't find the doctors to be too terrific at that. They were terrific at a lot of things, but the doctors weren't great at that. And so, you're sort of left to your own humanity. And I actually found, and this is a bit more stream of consciousness than I had intended, but if you object, yell. Otherwise, I'm just going to continue. I actually found that while I am not a religious person, and I have never been, in fact, I've always been sort of hostile to religion. I just never found it useful. I did find religion to be very helpful in a very specific way, in that when I was looking for a moral code or a value system or a philosophy that would helped me to think about how to define right and wrong in this, this extreme circumstance. I didn't find that speaking to friends or relatives, although they were incredibly supportive, I didn't find that to be all that helpful, because I always thought that people are influenced by their empathy. And so you weren't really going to get a straight shot from somebody about what is right and what is wrong. I never really quite trusted it, because people are kind. And so I always thought that unless you were really a complete maniac, if I showed up on your doorstep and I said, I need to talk to you, and I did that with different people over a period of many years, unless you're a complete maniac, you're not going to be unkind in that conversation. It would be very hard to say in response to my bending your ear, why don't you straighten up and fly right? This won't do. You're not getting it right. This is not appropriate. Nobody ever said that. And I don't think anybody ever would, even if they thought it. But I thought, well, religion isn't geared to respond to my particular circumstance. It's not malleable that way. You can't sort of, chop it up and move it around and make it say what you want it to say. The value, I thought, of religion was that it was this institutional body of values and philosophies and judgments about how to live well that would just yield some kind of answer. And it might be good and it might be bad for me. I mean, it might tell me what I wanted to hear or not, or I didn't know. So I thought, but whatever it tells me, it's permanent. It's not being shifted in order to accommodate me because it's coming from somebody who is being humane. And that's what I was looking for. I was looking for just the real honest to goodness truth about what is moral and what judgments needed to be made and how to live so that I would be comfortable with myself. I will tell you, I never got to comfortable. I still haven't, but I did find the institutional thinking to be reliable. At least it wasn't coming to me sort of pre-digested so that it would be to my liking. And everybody has their own views on religion, or people have different religions. I have no idea whether that works for anybody else, but I'm only telling my story. And in my story, that wound up mattering, to my great surprise, because I as I said, religion was always sort of got harsh treatment from me. I never thought it was terribly useful. So just quickly about the facts and the story. Susan and I met in college. She was a little sister of my fraternity. We dated for a long time. We got married when I was going into my third year of law school. And then we came back to Chicago and set up a household and started having kids when we were both 30. We were the same age. She was working at the time, and then after our first was a year old, she decided to stay home and raise the kids from home, which was not only fine with me, we were in agreement on that. We saw that part of the world the same way. And so that's what she did. And the plan was that she would go back to work when our youngest started school and was, away at school for the day. Unfortunately, when our youngest was 4, Susan got sick. And so she never did go back to work. And that started an odyssey for her and for us that lasted the next 20 years. She passed away a year ago, this past June. She was living in the house with the kids and me for 15 years. And then at the end of that 15-year period, when when our youngest went away to college, I decided to separate. It wasn't her decision, it was really mine. And she stayed in the house for some period of time, several years, with assistance. And that wound up being untenable. She moved to an apartment again with caregivers, and that wound up not working as she continued to get sort of worse and worse, and eventually wound up in an assisted care facility, which is where she was when she passed away. The details of her illness and impairments are the book, really, or a significant part of it. And I'm sort of reluctant to try to reproduce that in this brief conversation. Suffice to say that she suffered a loss that was really incredibly broad. She lost the ability to use half of her body, and the half that was functioning wasn't functioning particularly well either. Her ability to see was compromised. Her ability to speak was substantially compromised. She was able to use a cane during the early years after her hemorrhages, but not after that. She was in a wheelchair in order to get around any place more than a few steps. And her personality and the sort of the essence of who she was so damaged that it was terribly unfair and remarkable to watch. She really went from being one person to another, largely because there was a lot of frontal lobe injury that was involved in her hemorrhage experience, and a lot of loss of brain tissue elsewhere in her brain as well, which I had no way of, I mean, I didn't understand it at all until the doctors explained to me that when you hemorrhage in your brain, the brain swells up and then it just disappears. It's sort of the tissue dissolves. And if you take a scan of someone's brain and you look at it post hemorrhage after a certain period of time, there's just a lot of empty space because the brain tissue doesn't survive. So all of that went into a very difficult set of circumstances that we had to deal with. I wound up parenting essentially alone for a lot of years, and Susan was really struggling during that entire period of time. I think that's probably enough to give you a pretty strong sense of what the book is about and what this phase, 20 years or so of my life was about. And I would rather have a conversation about it than just continue to prattle on. So if there are questions, I'd be more than willing to take them, or they don't have to be questions. They can be statements or your own sort of experience. I know because this is the Angioma Alliance sponsored event, there are some people on this call who have their own experiences that may parallel mine, may be quite different. And I would enjoy hearing about those. So let me break here. Does anybody have anything to jump in with?
I'll talk. I have a big mouth. Dan, Stacy.
Hi, Stacy.
And hi.
How are you?
I mean, I'm wonderful.
Good.
So Richie's sitting here. We actually read the book together as we were traveling over the last week or so. And I just want to say that, I mean, I always thought you were a swell guy, but it really brought to me into my heart how painful it is when someone you love is failing, and the steps that you take to try to make humanity in your life, especially with your children, seem normal. when it's not. And you really handle it like a hero.
Well,
And
keep in mind, I wrote the book, so,
You know, the funny thing about the book, it parallels stories you told me. So I know there's a lot of truth behind the writing and the thought that went into it. And I
Yeah.
commend you. It was a very moving experience to read it.
well, thank you.
And it really did. And it moved me. And I haven't been moved by writing in a long time. I knew some of the story because we talked about them, but the heartfeltness that you put into it, the thought, the consideration, and what you had to go through, it's remarkable. You did a great job. And you did a great job in raising your kids, finishing the life, and then putting it down on paper and sharing it with people so they can understand that kind of an experience. Because you're right, you're never going to find this online. Someone has to share it with you. And it was a very moving and wonderful experience to read your book. Author. Good job.
uh-oh, I think Dan froze.
Couldn't believe it. He's gone.
Oh no, here he comes.
Oh,
Did you
no.
miss it?
You're
Here-
back.
Yeah, I must have, it must have been my connection that broke. Anyway,
Yeah.
I missed much of what you,
Well, we'll talk about it when I see you, but I was just commending you on the heartfulness of what you wrote, how you wrote it, the experience, and how you brought it to people. It's to go through that experience and being able to share it the way you did, it's gonna be helpful to people.
well, I hope so. And I, the part of that I'm fascinating on as I'm listening to your comment is it's very difficult to sort of break through and get a book pushed out into the world and have an audience develop for it. I mean, it's only been several weeks, but I can tell from what I was told about the publishing industry these days and the way books are reviewed and basically not mostly. So I would like it to be helpful to people, but they're going to have to know it's there. And so that challenge is something that I'm trying to figure out.
No,
Good.
your publicist needs to help you on that one because it's a great message. And it's something that can move people in the right direction.
Yeah.
And I guess probably was the intent of writing the book, other than to get it all off your chest. But I just commend you. It was well done.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
I was.
Thank you.
Anybody else have a?
Megan dropped something
What?
in the chat. She was curious if your children are impacted by CCM as well, if it was just your wife. Does she have
So
a
the-
sporadic lesion?
Yeah. I'm sorry. I missed the last thing you said.
I was just asking if she had a sporadic lesion that impacted her.
I don't know what that means. Can you explain? I don't know what that is.
Yeah, what did she have a genetic form of the disease, or was it just one lesion that
Got it. So I think the answer to that, we've tested for that, and what they told me was that she did not have the genetic form of the disease, as far as they can tell. But there is a certain subset of cavernous angiomas that don't tie out to a genetic marker that they've been able to identify. So the test is only about, I mean, it's not only, it's pretty good, but I mean, the test I think is about 85% or 90% of all the lesions tie out to some genetic marker. They're able to identify one way or the other. The end result for us is the information that we got is that her version of cavernous angioma is not a genetically, it's not genetic, and it doesn't wind up being passed to the kids. And so, that bullet, at least so far, has been dodged.
Are there any other questions? You guys can all unmute yourself now if you want. You don't, if you need help, just let me know. I can help unmute you here. But yeah, we can just have this be kind of an informal conversation at this point. If there's other questions, we can all kind of chat. So don't feel like you have to stay muted anymore at this point.
I had a follow-up question. Thank you so much for taking the time as a caregiver to give us your insights. And mine is kind of related to just the emotional roller coaster of it. It sounds like there were stages where things weren't so bad and then things got a little bit worse and then there was a progression of it. I guess, how did you keep your head above water in those situations, especially when you were raising your children?
Well, I would say, well, two things. One, I didn't always keep my head above water. I mean, I think that I certainly did try, and I think honestly I did most of the time, but not always. And I think the reason that, to the extent I was able to navigate this, was that I had a ton of responsibilities. I mean, I had three little kids that, you know, they were and are the most important things in my life. And so they drove a lot of my purpose, because they needed to be raised and not in a dismal house. They needed to be raised in a place that was going to be happy for them, or as happy as it could be. And I was a partner in a law firm in Chicago, and that was very demanding. I mean, the world sort of doesn't stop because I had a tragedy in my life, even if the tragedy was ongoing for a long time. People are very nice, but at the end of the day, you run your own world and they run theirs. And so between my kids and the obligation that I had to be good at what I was doing professionally, there wasn't a lot of time to, flake out. That wasn't part of the deal.
Thank
have
you.
a-
Yeah,
I have
that makes sense.
Hey, Dan, I have a thought. Sorry that I'm shutting up, but as I was reading the book, my father has Alzheimer's and I'm dealing with him from afar, but I do a lot of the work. And it's the same, obviously in a shorter period of time, but that progression of losing them and their personality.
Yeah.
And at some point you just have to, I guess, it becomes a reality and you need to take it on. And then the next step is how you take care of them safely.
Yeah. Well, I've never had to deal with that. And I don't know how to compare these things. I don't think you are, but I think one of the lessons that I drew from dealing with all this over a long time is that everybody to the extent you have tragedy in your life, and heaven forbid, and not everybody does, but to the extent you do, everybody's tragedy is their own. And it's sort of, if you hear my story, it doesn't make your next moment with a parent with Alzheimer's any easier in a sense. I mean, you still, that's your own tragedy, and comparing them is of limited use, I think. But maybe there are some things that, common things that, you can draw from it. I do think, I would imagine that one's sense of obligation to a failing parent as a child tests you, and it tests your, yeah. And I think that's probably similar. That's probably sort of the same thing.
I guess what I was getting at is the way that you handled it empathetically, even though it was painful, and understood that even though it's difficult, you still had to have a happy home. you still had to have your children, go to school and feel good about themselves. So life, like you said, went on, and I think that theme went through the book.
No, well, good. I mean, I'm glad to hear that, actually. I'm not sure I wrote it with that specifically in mind, but I think that is what I was trying to do as I was living and as I was living the experience. So I'm glad it came across.
Yeah, it did.
Yeah.
I had a question.
Mindy,
Hi, Dan.
how are you?
I'm well, thank you. So you should all know that Dan was my mentor as I was a young lawyer, even younger than Dan. And so I've always known you are a fantastic writer. And I'm just interested to know how you decided, I also have done a lot of legal writing, not nearly as much as you, but I always think creative writing is a whole different can of worms. And it's, I always think like, well, how would I have ideas? So I'm just wondering if you had thought about, and now I guess it sounds like the book you're working on now is a novel. So I was just wondering how you decided to do the kind of memoir writing and then the novel writing, just how you decided to get into that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a way that I express myself. It's what I go to sort of naturally. I think it is the way I'm sort of put together. I have an easier time writing as a way of expressing myself and even thinking than anything else. I do think that, as you know, perfectly well, a lot of good writing as a lawyer comes out of, at least in the moment you're doing the writing, believing in what you're saying. I mean, there has to be some intellectual honesty if you're going to write well, and you have to buy into whatever the argument is, whatever that. Well, and I found that this was no different. I mean, if I was going to, it's a different truth, it's a different honesty. Not a different honesty, it's honesty about a different thing. But if I'm writing for a client, I try to find the essential part that I believe to be true and express that, and that's the argument. That's the best I'm going to do. I was doing the same thing here in the sense that I was trying to get down what the essence of the experience was. And if I could find a way to express that, then that was going to be persuasive, not the way a legal argument is, but authentic. And it would be, so I don't think these are different skills, honestly. I think they're sort of the same thing. You're just tapping into a different part of your head. And, writing this was not an argument. It wasn't intended to be persuasive that way, but it was intended to be intellectually rigorous and expressive. And I think if, somebody I was talking to yesterday was saying to me, was it difficult to write something that was really raw, sort of honest? And I said, yeah, intimate, that's right. And my response was, if I wasn't going to write it that way, I really wouldn't have anything to write, because I'm not sure, what would you write? I mean, I could.
That's why I was asking kind of about this particular story versus, just writing fiction too. So
yeah, and we'll see how the novel writing business goes. I mean, maybe that doesn't go so well. I don't know, but I'm going to give it a shot. Yeah, we'll see. We'll see. It's good to see you.
You too. You too.
All right. Well, I don't want to keep everybody. I mean, if that sort of, if anybody has anything further, or if you want to talk offline, my suggestion is that if you don't have my email, I'll give it to you if you'd like it, or Lindsay has it, and you can give it to whoever would like it. If there's a conversation that somebody would like to have and doesn't want to do it in a group setting, just reach out, and I'm happy to do that. So, if there's anything I can do for Angioma Alliance as you guys are moving forward, if you can think of anything that I can do to help, then please let me know.
Absolutely, thank you. Thank you for doing this. We really appreciate you taking your time. Your story from a caregiver's perspective, I think, is so valuable. There's a lot of caregivers out there that I will say, being one myself, I feel like you focus a lot of time on your, you know, in my case, my child, or your wife or your husband or whatever, and you kind of almost lose your identity in a sense. So, you know, your perspective is very valuable, and I think it touches a lot of us as caregivers as well.
I'm glad you said that. I think that's important, and it's tough stuff.
It definitely is. It definitely is. It is hard all around.
Yeah.
So anyway, thank you very much. I appreciate you all being here. And this is recorded. Hopefully I can figure out how to transfer it over. Technology always fails me at some point, but and yes, I can pass on Daniel's email address for those of you that are asking. I will pass that on. And then we'll go from there. All right, so I need to write down email. Actually, I'm gonna put my, just because as soon as I close this meeting, I'll lose all these messages right now. So I'm gonna put my email in the chat, and you guys can send me the requests there if that works. So everybody has my email now, and that way everybody can get it. All right. Okay, everyone, have a wonderful night. Thank you, Daniel.
Thanks, Lindsay. Take care.
You too.
Thank you.
You're welcome.